that's why I was particularly touched by your homage, honoring me, certainly, by comparing me with Ed McBain, because one of the things I so enjoyed about the McBain 87th Street Precinct books were the characters.
Absolutely. Fat Ollie. Can you remember when Fat Ollie wrote his book? Remember when he lost the pages of his novel? I mean, it was Fat Ollie Weeks, isn't that the guy's name? Yeah. But that was indeed part of the charm, was Corella and Fat Ollie and the whole bit. And I think with Joe, the charm is the people that he's worked with. And when he was in Brattlesboro, it was small, and then eventually you found a kind of an interesting way to give him larger scope. And what is
double
it?
way.
Well, that's true.
A double way.
How's that worked?
I changed narrative viewpoints as well as changed Joe's job. So we begin life in open season 1988. You have Joe Gunther, his cast of characters, and it's first-person narration. Joe is speaking to us, the readers, and we get right inside his head. And at the time, that was a huge breakthrough for me. I was kind of showering, wearing a raincoat, trying to get through to what makes Joe tick. And I was, all of these first drafts were written in third person. And I decided, let me...
Didn't have any life, did it?
Yeah.
That's hard to do.
Let me try this.
Right.
You know? So I went to first person. Well, first person's a little bit creepy because you feel so, as a writer, you feel so exposed until you remember the primary rule of writing, which is you are a reader first and foremost. You are writing for readers, and readers have a way of interpreting those words that come off the page. And it's that filtration process you need to pay attention to. They don't care who you are as the writer, because part of the reading process is to take possession of that story, turn it into a movie in your head, and go from there. So the author disappears. In fact, if the author shows up, it's because he either showed off, or screwed up. Okay.
The S's, right? The evil double S there.
Bingo. So the author's job is to disappear. So I recognized that and came to terms with that. And therefore, the first 6 or 12, about 12 Joe Gunther books were first-person narrations. However, the cast began to become more and more integral and more interesting.
Right.
So by book 12, I'm sitting there going, these guys are getting shortchanged. I wish they could have more stage time, but since these books are first-person narrations, how do I give them more stage time? Well, you change it. So I created a book called A Sniper's Wife, in which case the crankiest of Joe's companions takes center stage. It's a third-person narration. Joe isn't even in half the book, although he pops in periodically. So that was the first major change, was this narrative point of view, POV, as they say popularly nowadays. So that's the first thing. The second thing was to get him out of Dodge, to change his job from being a Brattleboro detective, which I eventually found too parochial. And how can I give him easy, not necessary to be explained access to the entire state of Vermont? Well, it turns out that law enforcement officers in the state of Vermont are uniquely blessed. They can function as cops from border to border, regardless of where they are. There are no jurisdictional limitations for a cop in Vermont. So, by changing his job to an office that sort of oversees all of Vermont, nothing else needed to be changed. So I created something called the Vermont Bureau of Investigation, VBI. Well, VBI doesn't exist, so if you ever get into a jam in Vermont, don't call VBI. You'll die of loneliness. But they are a major crimes unit. Now, the Vermont State Police played with this notion, but it never really sort of panned out because there's not enough money and not enough personnel, and blessedly, not enough dead bodies. We only average about 7 homicides a year in Vermont.
Well, that would certainly be overkill. You know, it's interesting. I mean, basically, the Scotland Yard was way ahead of everybody in this. I mean, Scotland Yard has always had a nationwide brief in England, although they have to be invited in. They don't get to just
waltz in. That's the same with my unit.
Right. I saw that.
They always play ball.
Well, you've always written well, I think, too, about jurisdictional disputes.
I love the politics.
You do.
Yes.
And other authors have used that as well. Now, John Sanford has recently done exactly what you have done. You may not have known this,
No.
but Lucas Davenport, who has been a Twin Cities cop forever, I think, was growing too much baggage for John. I mean, he got him married and, you know, whatever.
Yes.
So he has created the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, I think it is.
Good Lord.
And Davenport has the same kind of brief now that Joe has.
Okay.
And he's done a second series with a Davenport protege coming along, who is really kind of a young Davenport. You know, the same kind of off-the-wall moves, the same, you know, I don't want to say he's a cad because that's not fair, but, you know, the same pheromones attracting women, all the rest of it.
Interesting that he creates a sort of younger version of a pre-existing character. You'd think he'd want to do someone completely different.
He says, even in the book, the reason I particularly mention that is there's a line when I'm having one of those horrible senior moments where I just can't remember the name of the new character. But anyway, he does something or other, and one of the guys says to him, you know, you're just like Lucas, you know, when he was young.
Interesting.
And I thought, this is John's way, rather than, because he has said several times to me that maybe he just needs to kill Weather and the family and, you know, free up Davenport again. And I think he decided that it was even better to kind of, you know, create another guy. But because they can now go all around Minnesota, the two cases that the protege is working, I will think of the name roughly an hour after we're done with this program.
That's exactly right. I'll phone it in.
Yes, Heat Lightning is the new book, and Dark of the Moon was the first one. But in any case, they're in two small towns. They are not urban. They are not Minneapolis, Twin City. Now, you, on the other hand, in Brattleboro, it's not, I don't guess a small town is quite fair, but it's certainly not a lot bigger than that.
Let's put it this way, that our largest city in the state of Vermont, which is Burlington, and the greater Burlington area accounts for 33% of the entire state's population. Remember those 26 people.
Right.
Most of them live in and around Burlington. Nevertheless, Burlington, as our largest city, is the United States' smallest largest city. So of all the 50 states, and each one boasts of a biggest city, Vermont's last, with Burlington. So Brattleboro is the fourth largest city in Vermont. So we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's a long story short. There are about 11,000 to 12,000 people in Brattleboro at night. It's a hub town, so it's going to swell a little bit during the day. But that gives you an idea that, yes, they are urban tales, but who's kidding who? 12,000 people? Good Lord. You know.
But you know what? When you read them, it doesn't really feel that way. I mean, you know, Bellows Falls has always been one of my absolute favorites, and what goes on in there could easily be going on in Chicago.
See, that's my point. That's my point exactly, because my view of human nature, why I called myself earlier a social anthropologist, was because I thought from the start with this series that I could construct a sort of human analysis, but I could do so on a small stage where we could clearly identify the various players rather than burying them in gigantic bureaucracies. It would make it easier for me to research, it would make it easier for me to tell a story, and it would make for easier access on the part of the reader. But the human nature aspects, what makes people do what they do, essentially remains unchanged. Now, there would be one huge exception to that, and that is that Vermont is probably the whitest state in the Union. So when we're talking about ethnic struggles and differences,
there's not a lot of that.
I can't go there, given my template.
Although you have moved Joe into, I mean, because Vermont, after all, is connected to other states pretty closely because of the geography. You have moved him into New Jersey, New York.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
You once set him into a part of Vermont. Was it your third book or second?
No. Strategically, it was the second book. We call it the Northeast Kingdom. It's a corner in the northeast part of the state, which is just by feel and by culture utterly different than the rest of the Vermont.